Hello, Johnny. Welcome to the show.
Hey Miriam, nice to see you.
Yes, we already started a little bit of warm-up conversation. Then I had to pause to hit the record button as fast as possible because there's so much juicy content already. Speaking about creative well-being.
Mm.
And before we are getting there and to the unhurried part, let's slow down and start at the beginning. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
Well, I do actually have a very specific answer to that question. Because 20 something years ago, I'd gone through a phase. I used to work in advertising. I had my own agency, and for a variety of reasons, that stopped working for me as a business. Business became a bit more difficult for a variety of reasons, and I got less interested. I think because you get to a certain age and you start to realize that spending time with clients talking about the size of their logo just doesn't feel like a really good use of your time. So I think I increasingly kind of sabotaged my work. Around the same time, I was doing a lot of group work in a psychotherapy training and starting to find that the dynamics of groups were much more interesting than the advertising that they might have been working on. So I started to get interested in working with groups. And I went through a phase of having rather long-winded answers to the question, what do you do? You know, there were waffly things about brands and groups and personalities and goodness knows what. And then one day I was invited to a speed networking event. And I went, which is odd because that's really my idea of hell. Networking done in a hurry is like a double whammy of things I don't like. But I went on a whim because a friend of mine organized it. And in a speed networking event, you meet a whole variety of people and you have like a minute to introduce yourself. So I thought, well, for the purposes of this event, I'm just going to have to come up with something really simple. So tonight, I'm just going to say I'm a facilitator because there isn't time for anything else. So that's what I did. For several encounters, I said, I'm a facilitator, which usually led to the question, what's that? So I had to explain. And it's not as if I had a blinding flash of light or revelation, but I realized after that is what I started calling myself because it was easier than explaining this more complicated life story that I got into the habit of telling people. So that's when I first started using that term to describe myself.
Beautiful. And it sounds as if you were facilitating your own elevator pitch.
I suppose. Yeah.
By giving it a label.
Yeah. And and I have quite mixed feelings about it as a label. I think it's a bit tiresome. I find in Britain anyway, if you say you're a facilitator, at least 60% of the time you're looking at someone's baffled expression and realizing, oh, now I have to explain what that is. In other parts of the world, it seems like it's better understood. So that's a bit of a burden. And also it's a bit of a catch-all term, really, because I think it means very different things to different people. And a lot of people who label themselves facilitators, I look at what they do and I think, no, I think you're more like the chair of a meeting, and someone who enjoys being at the center of attention and inserting yourself into all the conversations, which is not my idea of what really good facilitation is.
Yeah. Yeah, isn't it interesting? As you spoke, I was wondering whether it's actually a gift or a curse that people might not understand the term, because if they do, as you say, they might understand something that we actually don't mean. And if they don't, then at least, then you have to go into the details and try to explain. And to me, this was basically the reasons why I started the podcast. I introduced myself as a facilitator, and the answer was, what? And now I find it interesting whenever I encounter facilitators from different spheres. So facilitators of healing workshops or dance workshops or arts and craft. And then to disentangle, when I say I'm a facilitator, oh, yes, me too. Facilitate workshops. Yes, me too. Well, we're more kind of verbal workshops. And then we get into the nuances. And as you were speaking about you getting tired of the advertisement world, Did you ever get tired, or what prevents you from getting tired of the facilitation work?
That's an interesting question. It's like I can't really help myself from doing that kind of work. I think I had a sort of a kind of, I crossed a threshold 5, maybe more years ago, where I realized that my recovery time from unsatisfactory gigs had suddenly become a lot shorter. So it used to be that if I did a facilitation that was unsatisfying and frustrating, as the work, quite often is, because, we live in an imperfect world and it's very hard to get the balance right in facilitation, I would sometimes for about a week be thinking, why do I do this for a living? This is so hard and so unrewarding. And so difficult. And then I noticed I crossed a threshold where I might feel like that for the rest of the day, but the next morning I'd wake up and think, well, that was very unsatisfying, but in a really interesting way. I wonder what went wrong there. And I started to find the quote unquote failure, it wasn't really a failure, but the unsatisfying thing interesting. And so I think what happens between people, whilst we might in the short term experience it, well, we might experience it as joyful, or we might experience it as deeply frustrating. It soon becomes interesting to me, at least in the rear view mirror. And I think that, so what sustains me in doing it is that it never stops to be fascinating to me, how groups work, whether they work well or badly. It's always kind of interesting.
And there are no two workshops being the same, right? So it's always
new. And I just have this experience. If I run a process that I'm familiar with, I often fall into a certain way of describing it, and there are certain jokes I might use that get a laugh. And then sometimes I'll use one of those jokes and it doesn't get a laugh, and I'm momentarily disappointed. And then I go, oh, good, or I'm glad that's not working anymore, because that's a nice wake-up call to the fact that nothing stays the same.
And since you mentioned the frustrating workshops, the unsatisfying workshops, what makes a workshop unsatisfying or a failure?
Well, I say unsatisfying rather than a failure, because I think failure is a very loaded word to describe something where there are probably, everyone who came to it will have had a different experience, and some would have enjoyed it and some wouldn't. And it's human nature to find the one person who's unhappy at the end of the meeting and focus on them and not the 99 who've been satisfied. But satisfaction feels like a more realistic way, because that's just saying, well, I have my experience of it and I'm satisfied or not. That doesn't mean it was good or bad. It's just, I think satisfying workshops I'm not quite as exhausted by as unsatisfying ones, I suppose. Satisfying ones more quickly get me to being fascinated by what happened or excited by what happened. Unsatisfying, I suppose, and I don't get that many that are really unsatisfying, at least the ones I run, because I'm doing things that I feel confident about, I suppose. But unsatisfying is where I suppose what it is where you feel like there's some dynamic here that I haven't quite got a grip of that's affecting how this is working, and I don't know what it is. But it's like you get a sense of, we've gone through the motions of discussing a subject, but something is going on here that's not getting a voice and not getting aired, and it's kind of, you get a sense that it's undermining the dynamics of the meeting, and it's all become a bit boring and safe. Or you get a sense of something being a bit repressed.
Something not being voiced. Elephant in the room. Yeah.
Yeah, well, elephant in the room, or, maybe it's something that I haven't said. Quite often it's quite useful to go, well, am I just projecting onto the meeting something that I'm not saying? And usually there'll be some element of that.
Do you have an example?
I might have to think for one of those. Nothing immediately concrete comes to mind, but I think generally, if I'm saying something isn't being said in a group, the real question is, well, what is it I need to say? You know, do I say it? Because I know the elephant in the room is such a terrible cliche, and I don't think it's particularly good practice to say, if you're the facilitator, to say something like, "Oh, I sense there's something not being said," because that's very smart-assed, isn't it? I think it would be more interesting to speak to your own experience, which instead of saying analytically, I sense there's something that's not being said, it would be braver to say, I notice my attention is wandering, or I'm feeling a little bit bored by what's happening, which is a riskier thing to say, but I think actually more exciting.
Yeah.
And,
Or I feel a
more,
tension.
yeah, and
Because
it's like
usually
me sharing my experience rather than analytically suggesting it's somebody else who should be sharing theirs.
Thank you for pointing that out. And I think that's then the next step to master facilitation, to take a stance and not to take to take some risks, and thereby also modeling that it's safe to do that. So to say, I sense some discomfort in the space or something unsettling, because usually I think when there is something that I would call an elephant in the room, then it's a tension that is not being voiced. Is someone holding back to state the obvious, whereas boredom is rather, I'm not touching the most important thing with the activities or the conversations that I'm offering.
I mean, there's no absolute universal truth about this, but there is, you know, because I will sometimes say, I don't know, something has come up, and then there's a long silence, and I'll sometimes say, I'm getting a hunch that perhaps some of you don't agree with this, which will sometimes provoke someone to say, well, actually, yes, you're right, I don't. You know, so you can make observations about what you guess is what was going on. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I think I'm just saying, I think more and more I'm trying to adopt a practice of voicing some of my experience. I think there's some subtle thing here about not placing yourself completely outside the group. You're in the group, you are part of the group. You may only be there for the day if you're a guest facilitator, but you're not outside the system merely observing what's going on.
The illusion of neutrality.
Yeah.
Reminds me of the discussion in the anthropological research, where an anthropologist comes to another culture to observe and to take notes and to be as objective as possible. But then on the other hand, by going there and observing, you're already impacting the system, and the culture will react to you. And I think with a facilitator in a group, it's similar. You're coming in, you're objective if you're an external facilitator, and still you're doing something to the group because they will react to you.
Yeah. I mean, you are a participant. You might be in a particular role. I mean, obviously there's a role of facilitator, which, you know, constrains what you do, but you're still a participant. You're still part of the group. To see, you can't not be part of what's going on in the room in that sense.
Although it's interesting, because I would say that you cannot participate and facilitate at the same time. And I would say that because I think to really hold the space and to facilitate or to support the group, you have to listen to a different degree, and to have some distance to the content. And I assume you mean a different way of participating when you say participating.
Yes. I mean, there's all sorts of nuances to these words, aren't there? Because yes, I think my job as a facilitator, I often say to myself, is to stay out of the content of the meeting. To a really high degree, I think in my case, I'm really quite disciplined about staying 99% of the time out of the content of the meeting. I'm often flying really close to the wind when doing that, because I literally don't know what people are talking about a lot of the time. And I might be thinking, gosh, they're going to rumble me, because surely they're going to expect me to be following along here. And yes, you need to be following along to some degree, but yes, you are there to kind of keep your eye on the process rather than the content. So I do get that. And yet you are still participating. You are in the room. The best feedback I've had from people, the feedback that most pleases me. I remember getting this at an event I did with a bunch of activists a few years ago. Someone came to me and said, I've been watching you do this meeting, and what I notice is you seem to know when to vanish into the background and become invisible, and when to step in and do something. And a lot of people aren't able to make those choices very well, but I'm watching you, and I think you've done that really well. And I thought that's high praise to me, because yes. I think the art of this is when to get out of the way and not, and really let people roll. And when you see something going on that's not helpful, doing something about it. So I think at that event, there were times when just little subtle things like where somebody was going on and on in a group session in a way that I could tell was sucking the energy out of the room, and I would step in and say, do something to stop that. And then other times there's something interesting was happening, and it would be like, no, I'm absolutely not. I'm not getting in the way here. In fact, I'm consciously going to leave them to do this for themselves, because it's so much more interesting than if I try and steer it and control it.
Yeah. And I think the nuance to sense when is it helpful for the group to step in. So, because sometimes there might be personalities, so it might be a little bit rough, and to then distinguish what is me projecting to a group because I feel uncomfortable with what's happening. Whereas, okay, this is clearly disturbing the group and I have to step in. I think there is another nuance here. How do you know?
Well, you can never know. I mean, you're probably familiar with that sort of cliche of facilitation, reading the room. We're supposed to be very good at reading the room. And in one sense, I think I am reasonably good at reading the room. I've been doing this for a long time. I've got quite good instincts. But equally, that's a preposterous thing to think. How can you possibly know what's going on inside a head of, if there's 10 people in the room, there'll be 10 different experiences happening. And it's ludicrously easy to project onto people something that's your own experience. I do a bit of facilitation training, and I often say, what might be better than trying to build up your sense of being your mysterious power of reading the room would be to ask the room, run a process that gets people to say, I mean, sometimes is it too hot in here, or or give us an indication of whether you're too warm or too cold, or let's get in a line for. I mean, one of my favorite things I'm doing at the moment at the start of a meeting is I say, let's do a line up in the room according to how energized and up for this meeting we're feeling right now. And if you're really super up for it, to the point where you want to bring on the leotards and the interpreted dance, you stand at that end of the room. And if for whatever reason you're not feeling it up for it right now, and it may be because you don't like the look of me, or it may be you've been distracted by an email, or there's a crisis at home, or maybe you just haven't had enough coffee yet, you'll be at that end of the line. And then you get people to take a position on how they're feeling right now. And I'm doing it slightly playfully, but in a way where you're saying it's legitimate to be anywhere on the line, or not attached to you all being happy. And then the room can see, oh, well, not everyone's in the same place as me. How exciting, how interesting that there are different energies in the room. And I'd lean a little more into that than into any kind of fantasy that I'm some, gifted mind reader. Because it's so incredibly easy to look at an impassive face and assume they don't like me. Very narcissistically, when it could be any one of a dozen things going on. It could be just one of these people who has a very still face and isn't very expressive.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe very focused, and that's why or closing their eyes just to be more concentrated instead of falling asleep. So I think it's very easy to misjudge. On the other hand, there's something I think that we can sense. For instance, when it comes to interpreting silence, when you have a loud silence or an uncomfortable silence, or just a Contemplative, self-reflective silence. I think they have a different sound. And it's maybe it has to do with body language or how the entire atmosphere slows down.
It's it's really hard to know for sure, though, isn't it? Because when we use this phrase awkward silence, and I think we all know what it means to be in one of those, so it's a perfectly legitimate term. But I sometimes, if I'm being really pedantic, I just have to ask, well, so where is this awkwardness? And I think the answer has to be, it has to be an experience I'm having in order for me to diagnose it. So there's something in me that's happening, and it's and it's very easy to confuse my anxiety in silence. And if I'm the facilitator, my anxiety in a silence is often, oh, they're probably thinking I should be doing something and that I'm a useless facilitator for leaving this silence. But which quite clearly isn't what they're experiencing. They're going to be experiencing something else because they're not facilitating, and who knows what they're thinking. So I suppose we have to guess, don't we, in order to know whether to interrupt the silence by saying something, or, which is what I increasingly do, wait patiently. Because I'd say 9 times out of 10, and I think that's probably accurate, if I sit with the silence and don't do anything, it's eventually broken by something more interesting than anything I could have said.
Yes. And I was just thinking that maybe as a rule of thumb, as a facilitator, we always need to be at least an inch more tolerant and comfortable with silence than the most comfortable person in the room with silence. Because as you said, most of the time, our interpretation of the silence comes from our own discomfort. So if our baseline is, I'm comfortable with silence, then only then we're able to pick up the nuances, and when it really becomes awkward, or when there is something to be picked up that's not between our ears.
I agree. And I suppose I think, and I'm making a sweeping generalization here, I think we live, we're in Europe. I think we live in a culture that's very, very stimulating. We have social media constantly pinging us with little notifications and excitements. We probably see 1,000 or maybe 10,000 advertising messages a day. We can't open Facebook without being sold things in one form or another. So we live in a very busy, buzzing, fast-paced, impatient kind of culture. So the work of holding silence is probably, something we should lean into. We could probably do with a bit more rather than less. I think you used a phrase, it reminded me of a phrase that I sometimes use about, if we're not careful, we're going to allow our meetings always to go at the pace of the most impatient person in the room. And that's not good. Almost, that means almost by definition that most people are going to be feeling rushed.
Yeah. And then not be included, and then it's a threat to the safety. So what prompted your work on Unhurried? Was it the sense of we are rushing too much?
It wasn't as sort of logically calculated as that. There is an origin story for it, because when I moved to Cambridge, which is about 10 years ago, I thought to myself, I better get to know people. So I started going to a breakfast networking event. I kept going, even though I really didn't like it, because it seemed very fast-paced and impatient. Part of the idea was that, people would have an opportunity to speak for a couple of minutes about a challenge or an issue that they wanted to explore. And, people could sometimes only get 15 seconds into their explanation before people started saying, have you done this? Have you tried that? It's like, oh, they haven't even said what the problem is yet. And you're already, it was full of interruptions. It was very alpha male in its energy. And I went quite a few times before I stopped, because I thought I just can't do this anymore. And around that time, I thought, and then it prompted me to actually offer an hour and a half later, so people could go to one and then the other, a conversation with a talking stick as a kind of antidote. So a conversation where you take turns to speak uninterrupted, and you mark that by holding, a sugar bowl or something. And if you're holding the bowl, you talk, and if you're not, you listen. And if you're the speaker, you decide when you've finished, and then you put the bowl down, and sometimes someone else picks it up. And that was quite fun to do. And around the same time, I remember having a conversation with my friend Anthony Quinn about improv, because we were both into improv, comedy mostly, and in the audience and sometimes as performers. And we were talking about how, yes, we love improv, but we're admitting that it can also be absolutely excruciating when it's not done very well. And especially if I'm the performer doing it really badly. And somewhere in the conversation, Anthony said something like he thought the difference between good improv and bad was that good improv was unhurried. And it was kind of like a little conversation bomb went off in my head. And I just thought that was a really powerful word. And I think, straight away I thought, oh, and that might apply to other parts of our life. So he planted the word unhurried in my head. Then I used it to describe that conversation. I thought, oh, I'll call it an unhurried conversation. That's a good word to describe this talking stick process. And so I started hosting, roughly every couple of weeks, an unhurried conversation. And all I had in mind was a conversation with a talking stick. But gradually I started to sort of notice things in the conversation and in my life where unhurried would be a useful word to set off other thoughts about how we might operate. And so I didn't plan it, but gradually I started creating more experiences and thoughts around unhurried. And perhaps 3 years after starting those conversations, I thought, I'll write a blog post about what I've learned. And I started writing, and it became quite long. I thought, oh, it's taught me, I'd learned more about this than I realized. And a year after that, I updated it, and it became even longer. And eventually someone said, my friend Viv said, oh, you should turn that into a book, which I did, 2 or 3 years ago. So it's kind of, we like to tell the stories of our lives. If I had this blinding insight and I decided to create a project called Unhurried, it was much more anecdotal and accidental than that. So, Unhurried has taught me things. I've kind of learnt by accident, by practice, what I think, Unhurried could be about.
And what I love is in your description that it was an unhurried way to write a book. By expanding slowly the blog post and adding your learnings.
I'd love to say it was totally unhurried. It was agony, to be honest. And it was fits and starts. But yes, fortunately, I did realize that in the blog post about Unhurried and in other blog posts I'd written over the past, 10 or 15 years, I actually had a lot of material to work with. So the book was more about grabbing things that are already written and then quite painfully at times trying to sort of structure it and organize it. And then putting it down for 3 weeks in frustration because I couldn't work it out, and then picking it up and fiddling with it. And I remember the point at which I decided I could publish it was when my friend Rob Poynton said to me, I think it was Rob, he quoted, I forget who, but some artist or other, it might have been Picasso, I don't know, who said, art is never finished, it's only ever abandoned. And I that sort of gave me permission to publish it, not because it was perfect, but because I knew until I'd printed it, I wouldn't be able to get on with anything else in my life. It had become an obstruction to the next idea. So I got it published, and it turned out to be true. I started having other ideas because I'd sort of finished with that project, and I'd kind of abandoned it, if you like, to the world, and I could get on with some other things.
Beautiful, detaching. And from our conversation, I have the sense that you're a very fast thinker and that you think on your feet. So how do you, and I wonder, does unhurried always mean slow? Also unhurried improv, does it mean slow improv? Or is there a nuance to unhurried that must not necessarily mean slow?
I mean, I have to, don't I? Because I can't help myself. I do talk very fast, and I try to remember to slow down, and then I forget because I'm quite an excitable character. So I have an interest in sticking up for it not always being slow, because I couldn't live up to that.
That's what I sense.
And I do, and actually there is a serious point, because I think there is a difference. And the metaphor I often use is, if you watch the pit crews in Formula One, when a Formula One car comes into the pits in, I don't know, it's like 15 or 20 seconds, or maybe it's 30, 12 of these mechanics all over the place, tires, fuel, repairing things, a frenzy of activity, very, very fast. But they very rarely spill the fuel and set fire to the car. It's incredibly coordinated because they've practiced. And I think they've practiced to the point where they're beautifully in sync with each other and not tripping over each other's toes and not dropping, the wrenches on each other. And I would say that that's unhurried, because it's not frantic. It's done at the right pace. So yes, I think when I say unhurried, I think it's about, it's not necessarily slow. It's going at a pace appropriate to the event or what you're doing. And in improv, you could have very speedy scenes, but what I think makes the scene work is that the actors aren't kind of tripping over each other. Because what I think we picked up, Anthony and I, in improv that we were in, that we didn't like, is when the actors are nervous, they tend to put too many ideas into the scene, and they don't really listen to the other person's ideas. They add their own, and then they start creating what I call these marshmallow motorbike scenes, where the scene just becomes more and more preposterous because they're adding too many ideas to it. And what starts off as a conversation between two painters ends up being two people going to Mars on marshmallow motorbikes. They've just created ever more absurdity. And it's, the audience sort of laughs a bit awkwardly, but it's not really very satisfying. So it's not the speed alone, it's the layering and the pause, it's the layering and the listening and kind of the actual human engagement with each other.
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit of a moment when we are in a rush and we are looking for our keys, and then we want to make it fast, or we're looking for our wallet, and then the keys fall down and the wallet falls down. Everything takes eventually more time, as if we're going on half tempo to look for our wallet. Then everything stays in place and we'll find the wallet in a faster time, but in an unhurried way. Yeah,
I regularly catch myself in those situations, and my mind almost splits in two. Part of me is going, this is really, as if this is incredibly urgent. And another part is going, it's not that important that I find it right now. Why am I getting, but I am anyway. I get hooked into this slightly obsessive need to find them right now, as if my life is under threat if I don't. And yeah, I don't think it's just you and I, is it? It's that thing about, you can go around the same places 10 times, and then when you pause and relax, it is actually in one of the places you've looked. You've just hadn't not really been looking properly.
Yeah. And then, yes, because we're creating too much noise, as in your example with an improv scene, there's getting too much noise in terms of content. And when we're looking for something, there's too much noise in terms of movement, and items that could possibly catch our attention.
And I think that there's a yes, and I think that this phenomenon is happening a lot, where one of the things I'm really fascinated by is difficult conversations and helping people to have them. And one of the things I learned from experimenting with how we have difficult conversations is they often go wrong when one of the parties to the conversation says a lot, and it might, let's say, imagine, person A has said to you something provocative, and the person will often respond with, well, it's not that I don't agree, and I do understand what you're saying, but I think there's a way in which what we need to do, and is there possibly, and they say a lot because they're unpacking the entire contents of their fevered imagination. And then the other party responds really angrily, not because the content is wrong, but because this is a really rubbish dance in which I'm not getting any turn. You're just going on and on and on. But it's what we need is an iteration of smaller turn taking. So you have an argument. The argument appears to be about the content, but really it's really like just saying that this isn't a very fun dance. I'm not getting in the turn. I'm not getting an equal turn in this. And not always, but often the best response to a very provocative interruption from someone is a quite short response back rather than a very long-winded, snappy one.
Good one. Which would then also invite the other one to respond again. And then it gives us the sense of being heard and seen, which is usually the reason why we have arguments in the first place, because we don't feel heard and seen.
It's sort of, yeah. So, and it's so easy to argue about the content and miss all of that much more sort of fundamental human stuff. And, going back to what I said earlier, because technology now is massively overstimulating us, it's worse than it ever was. So I think a lot of us are kind of caught in a tragedy of the commons on social media, where everybody feels under pressure to put lots of exciting ideas onto LinkedIn or Twitter or wherever, not noticing that, yes, but we're all doing this and none of us are being heard.
Yeah.
And what I think an unhurried conversation sometimes is able to create, I came up with this phrase, or it might have been my friend who came up with it, it's able to create a kind of an abundance of listening. There's something about the process that creates a deeper sense of actual listening happening. So there's enough listening for everybody to feel heard. And then the paradox is, when we feel heard, we don't have to say as much.
Yeah. And I would like to come back to something that you mentioned before we hit the record button. Your process of creativity and how creativity nurtures your well-being. And I'm thinking of this abundance of content that we have and all the constantly new pieces of information. So what I think I'm hearing is that you're also applying the concept of unhurried to your creative process.
I suppose I am. I'm rewriting that book about Unhurried, and I'm thinking a bit more deeply about what I mean by unhurried, and I'm starting to put more flesh on those bones, so that it's not just about tempo. It's about all sorts of ways in which we create a bit more imaginative space for ourselves and a more human kind of space in which to notice more of what's happening moment by moment. And I think what I'm sort of noticing I'm doing is, over the last year or two, actually, I used to blog very often, a lot. And then I kind of got bored and stopped a few years ago. And now I've noticed what I'm more likely to do is make a little 2-minute, 3-minute video about something and pop that up online. And I don't have a schedule for it. I don't do it every Tuesday. I do it when I feel like it. And I might go 3 weeks without feeling like it. But I think one of the things I like about the process of the video is the process of making it is quite therapeutic to me. Because, I live alone and I can feel very cut off from the world. But if I make a draft of the video and then I watch it back, and then I have a kind of relationship with myself, if you like, a different kind of relationship, because there's me and then there's this guy over there performing who I sort of recognize. I've seen him a bit, and I can watch it and I go, that was good, or that was a bit fast, I'll do it again. And I do another iteration. I have a relationship with that video, and it varies. Sometimes I might do 10 takes. Sometimes it only takes 2 or 3. I get it to a point where I go, that's good enough. I'm not aiming for perfection. Life's too short. But, I make a rough thing. And I notice that, and I suppose it goes back to the conversation earlier about what's satisfying as opposed to good or bad. I'm satisfied with that. And I can kind of post that and not get too attached to whether anybody comments on it or not. Of course, yes, I like it when people comment on it, but I try to get to the point of thinking I'm happy with that, whether other people like it or not. And so So it's being a bit creative, but for me, it's in a way that I find satisfying, as a kind of as a therapeutic process. In a way, I often find that writing doesn't give me quite that same sense of relationship to self. I mean, it is a kind of relationship, and I do some writing, but I think the video gives me more of that, and it embodies this notion, which I'm starting to pay more and more attention to, of iterating something out there into the world, even if it's only into a camera and onto a video, not to another human being, but as it were to myself at one's, time delay, as opposed to, which a lot of my life is this intensely thinking about things, lying in bed, spending an hour thinking about things, not noticing that this is just a very intense, rather isolating experience of myself. Whereas puts something into the world. It's not art in my case, but it could be art, or it could be a photograph, or in my case it's a video, or it might be a bit of writing, where we're taking some of our inner experience and putting it outside ourselves so that we can have a look at it and have a relationship to it. So it becomes a way of relating. I'm using these terms a bit loosely, relating to the world, or at least relating to ourselves in a different way.
Thank you for sharing that. It's a fascinating process, and it's funny for me. It's almost the exact opposite, I would say, because I'm too impatient to create this relationship with myself, watching myself. So I would record something, think, it's good enough, post it. On the other hand, you building this through this unhurried process of going through the iterations and then really peeling the onion and seeing what fits, you're then also preparing yourself to invite the audience to join this relationship in a different way.
I think what that little method ends up with is videos that have a quite informal, not perfect, unfinished, slightly chatty, slightly spontaneous quality to them, because there isn't a script. I might, sometimes I do 2 takes and sometimes I do 10, but I'm not like in my head going mentally through my list of things to say. I'm doing it spontaneously each time. And I think it offers a little bit more, I don't know what to say, kind of surface area. Because, I mentioned earlier that we live in this world in which we're under so much pressure to be kind of constantly producing content and selling. And here I am contributing somewhat to the pile of content on LinkedIn, but I'm trying to do it in a way that at least has some vestiges of receptivity about it, that there's something, contactful about the way in which I'm doing. I'm trying to create a bit of texture to the way I'm putting myself out in the world.
A conversation trigger, something that others can relate with and interact with, so that it becomes a conversation.
Yes, and I think part of that is allowing it to be somewhat unfinished thoughts, or things where you go, they might interpret that in different ways, and then go, well, I'm going to let them interpret it in different ways. I'm not going to try and completely explain, because my blog posts used to be quite sort of detailed, as if I was trying to be very, very clear. And I realized that often gets in the way of people relating to you, because it gets a bit boring having everything explained and specified. Somebody, I forget who, said something about it's almost letting the reader do some of the writing. I think was the way they put it. You let the other person also, complete the creative task. You don't do all the work for them.
Interesting. And what I hear is that the writing is so polished and perfect, because when we publish it, we want it to be the perfect version, because everyone could read it in their own pace. And by being too polished and too perfect, we leave out the possibility for wonder or or interpretation of the readers, so that they can actually really bring themselves into the text.
It's actually, I don't know why I'm thinking of this, but I'll share it anyway. I found myself making up a song in my head. entirely for my own, I say not, I was going to say for my own pleasure. I'm not even sure I was thinking it through that much. I just sometimes write songs in my head that never get performed. And there was a line in it that I was trying to make lots of rhymes with the word wander, yonder, beyond earth. And I had a line in that went something like, would life be fonder? And I thought, oh, I quite like that line because it's not very good. It's not the correct use of language, but it's playful and it's allowing, and the audience can enjoy the struggle. It's a bit of a lame rhyme because I can't do any more on the rhymes. That's a bit funny that I'm failing. But actually, what would a fonder life be? Oh, well, that's actually, I quite like that. That sort of gets my creative juices going. So there's something about, I suppose if something is art, it's leaving fuzziness for the other people to enjoy.
And I think it's also so human that we better connect with the imperfect and unpolished. I think it creates this extra level of trust because we are by definition imperfect. So if we are confronted with a perfect appearance of someone, there's something in us, I think, an instinct that's like, oh, something is not right, something is fake. So there's a little bit of doubt, which then stands in the way to really have a deep or human or trusted connection to that person.
Yeah, I think of my previous career, most people in marketing and advertising are trying very hard to produce very beautiful things. And I think it's often quite counterproductive. And I think where I've noticed this particularly in the last, few months, since I've been able to go back to some travel, I've had a few experiences of traveling to venues where, as it happens, the clients this year have chosen quite fancy venues. Which are very beautiful, have amazing lighting, and that even the budget venues, like I've stayed at budget hotels, but they've been very highly finished, they've been very modern, and so they're really quite impressive and rather, you go in, you're very pleasantly surprised. But what I've noticed is that the hard product, if you like, is fantastic, but the staff are often really worn out, partly because of the stressful time we've all had, partly because I suspect they're not being very well managed or paid. And I think all the money's gone into the hard product and they're stinging on the staff, and there aren't enough staff and they're worn out. And, and I'm thinking, I think I'd be happier if the venue were less shiny, but the staff, you felt like the staff you were not an imposition on the staff, that they were able to be present, that they were not stretched to kind of almost breaking point. Because I go into these places and I feel really sorry for them. I feel like apologetic for being a customer, and I think it's the same phenomenon that I think that you're describing, Miriam. There's something rather fundamentally human that we're missing in these very polished presentations.
I wonder though whether for the venues you're describing, whether it's really that they're cheap on the staff or whether they're not allowing the staff to be themselves. So if we're in this very polished, very sterile venue, maybe a little bit posh, then I can only assume that they go through this training of how to behave professionally. And then there's so many rules and so many guidelines that there is no space for a smile, for a human connection, for a little bit of imperfection that actually adds this warm glow of welcome that feels like home, that we're actually seeking when we're going to a venue.
I'm sure that's true. Do you know what it made me think of? Years ago, when I was doing a lot of traveling, I was piling up frequent flyer points, so I could occasionally upgrade myself to business class. Mm-hmm. And I often found it a bit disappointing because I get into business class and then I would feel like I had to behave like a businessman because everyone else was having to behave like a businessman. So the game in business class appeared to be not to enjoy it too much. That wouldn't look very fashionable. I thought, do you know, I think economy is actually nicer. You know, and I sometimes thought, instead of paying, I mean, I didn't pay, I upgraded for nothing, but you know, I sort of, instead of paying thousands of pounds, you know, for a one business class seat, you could buy a whole row in economy and bring a butler, you know, bring a friend and a bottle of champagne and have a really sociable time. I say a butler or a friend, bring someone else to keep you company with an empty seat in the middle, you know. And I do think airlines have kind of, they have also made this hard product error, I think.
Yeah.
They haven't created, I always look at aircraft and I go, there's a lot of social potential in an aircraft. Nobody's really quite thought about how to bring it about.
Yeah.
And their whole business model obviously relies on overpriced first class seats and so on to make the whole thing work.
Yeah, and then you don't want to enjoy it too much, because otherwise everyone realizes that you're not belonging there, so you're not the person who can actually afford it.
Yeah, and I think that's what you're describing is the staff in these fancy hotels are probably being drawn into this sort of rather stiff, formal excellence. It's sort of the kind of tyranny of excellence, as it were.
And I wonder whether maybe we didn't get the update or the memo that we're living in a different world now when it comes to this upper class or showbiz class. I think back in the days, those people we would see on media would be those who made it, the stars, the movie stars or the rock stars, and they do have a certain attitude, and they are always polished because it's basically their job. And I think nowadays everyone can be a star and everyone can appear on media. That's what we call social media. So it doesn't, and I think some are still running after this previous image of this is how someone on media shall look like. And back then it wasn't the point to relate to them on a human basis, because they were somewhere flying up there. They were the stars. Right. They were not interested in us relating to them. Whereas today, where everyone is building their own little stage to be a star, it's not about being polished, but it's about being relatable.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I think even before social media really took off, you know, because I used to work in advertising, or maybe when I was still there, you know, I started noticing a lot of people talking about personal branding. I always slightly died inside whenever that came up in a conversation, you know, the idea that I would have to make myself into a brand. And yeah, I know, yes, we do actually have to have websites and things, you know, there's going to be some marketing, but it does, you know, that pressure for us now, it seems like everyone has to be a brand. Oh, it's just so wearisome, isn't it? And what I've been trying to do these last few years is to do, in my head I call it unmarketing. I've noticed how when I try to market things, it doesn't seem to work very well, and the most interesting and satisfying work seems to find me by slightly more serendipitous means. Isn't it? So I'm quite curious about how do we ply our trade, because we need to make a living, and I like to work. You know, I do want to work, but can I attract the work without just fueling this, you know, this orgy of content provision?
And I wonder whether aren't we our brands by definition? So, and I think especially in the facilitation world, where we're basically selling ourselves, sounds very, very wrong. But I mean, if a client feels attracted to us to engage us, it's because of the way we think and the energy we put into the space.
It's funny, I slightly tear up when you say that, because I agree with you, and I wish I could remember that more of the time, because I think our environment is constantly trying to get us back to being, you know, part of the consumer model, a part of late stage capitalism, because actually, of course, that's true. I would say that we want to work with people who are, did you say attracted? I think that's the word, attracted to us, and it makes me wonder about this word, to be attractive. What do we really mean by that? Because it's easily muddled up with putting on makeup, as it were, and polishing, and getting Photoshop done and shining, and having the latest website, and that is one way of thinking about it. But, I think of moments in my life when I've been attractive in a different way. I remember, I don't know why I'm sharing this, but here I go. I remember doing a dialogue-y conversation many years ago. I think it was a talking stick process, and I don't think I was hosting it at the time. And I just sort of shared my experience, and then I noticed that somebody in the room started talking to me afterwards, and this person was clearly attracted to me, which came as a shock. It doesn't happen very often, and it took me a while to go, oh, is this what happens? Oh, I thought, well, I haven't said anything. I hadn't said anything impressive. I'd just been, and I hadn't been particularly heartfelt. I hadn't shared any deep material. I'd just been, I think, quietly present in the conversation. And it's interesting. This happened ages ago. I don't know, but my mind brought it up when you said what you said, because I think this is a different. I mean, even this conversation we're having now feels like it belongs to a different kind of energy, and it's. I'm tearful because there's not a lot of it. I'm going to speak. I think in my life, I'm plowing this unhurried furrow because I think it speaks to something deep in me, and I'm so aware of the pressure to do the other kind of, behavior.
Thank you for sharing that. And there are many things that come to my mind listening to you. One is the trying to be attractive to whom, because it's just an assumption, while we are the most attractive when we are just us. So maybe being attractive is about removing all the makeup and trusting that it will be attractive to someone. And I recently realized that I was actually looking for clients that I want to fall in love with. So I don't want to fall in love with I don't want my clients to fall in love with me or to be attractive to them. But and falling in love in air quotes, if I fall in love with my clients, then I become the best version of myself. And then I can really be of service and do something great. Whereas when I try to be attractive and want them to fall in love with me, then I think by definition, I'm putting up too much makeup, and I try to be someone who I'm not. And then by definition, I won't be the best version of myself.
Yeah, I mean, that does resonate, and it's sort of connected to, this phrase got used a few years ago. We're living in the attention economy. And so all these little flashy buttons on LinkedIn and whatnot are trying to grab our attention, because there's this constant fight for our attention. So what if we think about, this is my half-baked thought, but it connects to what you're saying is, so I think people are starved of attention. So what if we go about the world giving people our attention? What if we start with that? And I think that's connected to what you're saying. There's something about, what if I actually really attend to someone, to slow down enough to be actually present to them, and to not to necessarily explicitly understand the information that they might be giving me, but to actually be there and let them know that they are having attention. And, I said earlier, I think the unhurried conversations are often very satisfying because they seem to create a pool of attention for people, which we all, I think, need more than we realize.
I totally agree. To a point that recently, to follow your example, your experience in the unhurried conversation, I was recently out in the evening with a friend of a friend being in a conversation and noticing, asking him, at some point he was kind of touching his neck and grabbing his, and I asked him whether he felt uncomfortable and nervous about something. And he was just amazed by my level of attention and noticing that and asking and giving him the space to explain. And I realized recently that what we have lost is the ability or the willingness to fall in love with the conversation. And we then might mix it up with the speaker.
Oh,
although it's, and I think as facilitators, that's something that we do well. Hence, we might more often fall into these traps that other human beings are not used to get this level of attention and listening and space.
I think it's really interesting, isn't it? Are we falling in love with the conversation or with the speaker? And and I think that there may be something in each of those. It's not necessarily an either or, but there's something about since you don't seem to mind me doing this, I notice, oh, it's funny, this story just came into my head, which feels connected to this, and we'll see if it is when I share it with you. But I do this process for helping people have difficult conversations where we try to get an example of a very provocative thing the other person says, the most button pressing thing, and then we experiment with 1,000 different ways, well, not 1,000, but dozens of different ways of responding. And I remember one years ago where somebody said that his neighbor at a community event was discussing television with him, and it was one of those conversations about how
Oh, you're muted. I cannot hear you anymore. No, you're not muted. Something maybe broke down with your...
I'm changing phones.
Now it's good.
Is this clear enough? Because I've got another microphone I'm on now.
It's clear enough.
So I don't know how much of that you heard or missed. Shall I go back to that story again? Or
yes, if you could.
So I run this process where we practice having difficult conversations, and at this community meeting, his neighbor said to him, apropos nothing at all, of course, we don't have a television. Now, what was problematic about this is that he knows perfectly well that family did. This was clearly not true. I thought this was a lovely thing to work on, because it wasn't your usual really rude thing. It was like really just a really perverse thing. And he'd been completely thrown by it. And we thought, well, what could you say? And he tried a whole variety of ways of responding to it. And we weren't getting anywhere. And then out of nowhere, I said, well, let's try doing this in gibberish. So gibberish is a made-up language that improvisers use. And as it happened, we had some improvisers in the room who are quite good at doing gibberish, where you actually say, you intend the thing, you intend the content of course, we don't have a television. But instead of saying, of course, we don't have television, you'd go, oh, should we do it? So we tried it in gibberish. And my friend went, back. And we did it twice. And I suddenly went, oh, I see. This isn't about a television at all. This is a kind of flirtation. She's very lightly flirting with you. So what seemed to work to play back was a very mild boundary setting flirtation back. It wasn't encouraging it to go further, but it was just enough flirtation back for it to feel a balanced equation, and we could all get on with our lives. And of course, we could have spent the rest of our lives arguing about whether she had a television or not, but that wasn't the point. And I think this is a very long-winded way of saying there's so much more going on in the conversation than the apparent topic. In fact, it may not even be a topic. There's just this huge subtext going on. And that I think in his flirtatious reply, he was not getting distracted by the conversation, and he was meeting the other need.
And I love this example for so many reasons. One is it seems as if it could be a very nice exercise actually in workshops to use this gibberish, and maybe especially for difficult conversations, because I think as humans we have this instinct to mirror something. So if we hear gibberish, so of course we don't know the language, it's not a language, but I think almost instinctively we will mirror the tone or reply in the same kind of melody. So there will be, I think, be a connection on a human level, almost by design, which might calm down all the hard feelings and all the conflict, the underlying conflict, because it's just human nature at work that we will connect.
Yeah, I mean, I do love using gibberish. I don't do it enough because I think on the surface it seems completely preposterous and meaningless. We've taken out the content of the conversation. What was the point of talking if we can't understand each other? But actually, paradoxically, I think it creates a different, I'm actually thinking, I've noticed lately politics is so crazy at the moment. If you go on Twitter where there's politics going on, there's just constant outrage. Here's an outrageous thing he said to me, and I said outrageous things back. And you go, it would be good if they had to do it in gibberish. So instead of arguing about Brexit or import controls or immigration or whatever, if they were forced just to go, they'd probably have a much more satisfying conversation because they wouldn't be getting so argumentative. They would be going, oh, I've tried to ration my use of Twitter now, because it's very easy for me to get sucked into the sort of indignation machine, as I think it's Ewan Semple calls it, indignation engines. And we're trying to use arguments about politics to meet these much more basic and really much more simple human needs for acknowledgement and connection, which is what I think you were saying earlier, and that we've somehow distracted ourselves from those really rather basic needs with this excess of argument and cleverness. Yeah.
And I think we can play with it in many different forms. I remember we had at the Never Done Before community, one colleague, Grace Lau, she hosted a workshop that she called the Tower of Babel. And everyone came in and spoke in their mother tongue. So we were in a group where we had one speaking Mandarin, me speaking German, another one speaking Romanian. We didn't understand a word of what each other was saying, and still somehow we understood what we were saying. So after we shared, we always reflected back or tried to interpret the content, and it was surprisingly accurate. And also there was another layer of connection that emerged just by seeing the personality we become when we speak in our mother tongue. And when we know that it's actually not about the content.
I remember being in a therapy group, a long time ago, and an Icelandic guy in the group explaining, his issue. And the therapist said, I want you to say that again, but do it in Icelandic. And he looked a bit puzzled, but he did it in Icelandic. And it was just a beautiful thing to hear. And there was so much more. The whole thing sounded different. He felt different. We experienced him differently. And I think he felt heard without being, in a narrow sense of the word, understood.
Yes, and understood. And I think especially if we tend to communicate with others not in their mother tongue. So for instance, now I'm speaking English. I'm rather comfortable in English. But still, there might be, especially when the conversation gets heated, if we don't get the nuances right, that we don't feel heard and understood. And these are the perfect ingredients for a fight, for feeling neglected, for getting into a bigger conflict.
Or just getting completely exhausted. I imagine if, I am English, so I always have the advantage of speaking the default language of business, as it were, and it's very easy to forget. This is hard work for people. For whom it isn't native, and a lot is being lost in the translation.
And the false assumption that we understand each other because we're using the same words and assuming that that we have the same understanding of the meaning of the words.
And and I think what it connects to is, I think we overestimate the importance of that kind of, what I might call that linguistic alignment, as if that is the most important thing. A lot of effort in organizations goes into value statements or mission statements and these things, as if we describe this with enough adverbs, if we use enough words, we'll get everybody 100% aligned. And I think that's a slightly absurd goal, actually, because you can't get everyone 100% online for all the reasons that we've just talked about, and you wouldn't want them to be anyway. I think organizations work in a more messy way than that. And I did a video about this recently, about what the author called, a guy called John Clippinger, called the high register language. We often try to specify things accurately with words, and not in all contexts, but in many, it leads to less effective organization than when we use lower register, more ordinary, fuzzier language, often less precise language. People can intuit how to coordinate with that much more skillfully than when we try to tell them exactly what to do.
And I wonder whether it's because of similar reasons as the polished appearance. So easier words, we can relate to them. They feel more connected to us.
It's what's the word, visceral, felt, embodied sense of connection, which isn't this terribly intellectual exercise. It's just that feeling of being, well, I'm not quite sure if I'm right about this, but in my head I have this idea that our forebears mostly walked the savannah in groups of 30, or they'd never meet more than 30 other human beings in their life. That might not be accurate, but we were kind of, our brains sort of developed to manage that kind of social arrangement, where you wouldn't be constantly meeting new people. You'd know who you were with, and you would have all of those familiar, reassuring signals of belonging and togetherness. And we've massively escaped that.
Yeah.
But I think that need is still there.
And that's why we enjoy using a certain lingo, or differentiating ourselves through word, through language, through lingo, even appearance.
There's layers and layers to this, aren't there? Because I think sometimes the use of jargon and specialist language is intended to create this sense of, oh, I'm an insider because I'm using this language. And and there are places where it is useful. But then I think we're then back to inadvertently depriving ourselves of the and this is kind of the theme for me of Unhurried, is it's about us finding ways to create satisfaction merely by the way that we relate to each other, so we don't have to do as much consuming of the planet's resources as we seem to be doing.
You mean because it's more about the being than the doing?
I think it's in that, it's in that category. I haven't recently, but when I've been hosting in-person conversations in Cambridge, I'd organize them, and then on the morning I'd go to them in a rush, slightly annoyed that I'd agreed to host them because I was busy and what was I doing, and oh crikey, why have I agreed to do this? But 4 minutes into the conversation, I could just feel my whole body going, oh yeah, this is why I do it, because it's so nice. Because just the informal way of relating to each other with volunteers, we're not there to make anything happen, we are just there to have a conversation and to enjoy each other's company and experiences, is deeply satisfying. And I think the default in the culture is you get satisfied by buying things and consuming things.
And I think if we're very honest to ourselves, it's in order to numb everything that is missing.
I think the pattern that I know I catch in myself is that it's very easy for me, if I'm feeling uncomfortable, to solve it with more stimulus.
Mm-hmm.
I'll have a coffee, I'll watch a TV show, I'll buy something, I'll stimulate myself, because what I suspect I more deeply need is something different from that. Less stimulus or a different quality of stimulus.
And I think that's why these moments of unhurried conversations are so precious, because you don't have to hold the silence by yourself. I think to go through the process alone is very difficult. And that's why it's so tempting to just numb it with more Instagram feeds or Twitter, social media consumption. That when we're together, if there's someone to hold the space, it's, I think, easier for us to sit with our own thoughts and discomfort.
I think that's right. I think there's a kind of like, I sometimes not so much online, but in person, it's almost like I feel like there's a field of intelligence that's created when a group of people sit together, and it's like the field holds us. And it's more than the sum of the parts.
Yeah.
That here we all are with our, busy little brains turning stuff over, but to sit with others and go, oh, so everyone else is trying to make sense of this too. And I can relate to them as fellow trying to make sense of it. Whether I agree with the particular sense that they're making doesn't really matter so much as, okay, so I'm not alone in finding life complex, rich, entertaining at times, madly frustrating at others. Oh, okay, so I often act as if I'm the only one with this problem to solve. And it's like, oh, no, everyone's trying to make sense. And just the act of making sense, I'm going to say making sense together. And it doesn't mean that we have to make the same sense. We're joining in the action of each making sense. Is lovely. Very satisfying.
It reminds me of how deeply satisfying it is to just be human together. I recently I used an activity that I copied from a colleague, Jakob Kromi, where it was in the boring workshop, and he invited participants in breakouts of 2. Yeah, the workshop was hilarious. And this was my favorite activity, and I use it now to make people fall in love on Zoom. So in groups of 2, you have to describe a mundane activity that you do on a daily basis in the most detailed way. So, for instance, brushing your teeth or emptying the dishwasher. So I bend my knees a little bit and I move a little bit forward, and with my right hand, I open the dishwasher very, very slowly, because otherwise it falls. So it becomes very boring. And the funny thing is, this little activity that takes 5 minutes creates so much connection between the 2, because it gives them permission to be normal, mundane with each other. It takes away the pressure of being funny or being particularly smart or doing something outstanding. And they recognize each other because everyone brushed their teeth or empties the dishwasher.
I love that. I also wonder if there's another element to that experience, which is that's if I imagine being asked to do that and thinking, oh, that's quite difficult. Oh, that's quite challenging. I have to really think about this. So what we both those people get is the experience of being with someone else performing something that's a little difficult. And that can be very bonding, that kind of shared, I call it shared peril. I mean, it's a very lovely low-key example of it, but you've had to sit in a room and you both had to struggle a bit to do this slightly challenging thing, which is take the thing you do automatically and go, oh, well, I do this and I do that. And it's like, oh, and we've done that in each other's company. That is also, I think,
true,
quite connecting.
True. Because recently I was in a dance workshop, and we had to online, and we had to dance for each other. And this was extremely intimidating, but also in breaks out of 2. So very, very intimate.
Yes.
And so bonding, because and I think it was exactly what you just explained. It was a bit challenging, and still someone was there to see us, to hold space, and to witness us struggling a little bit and doing this together is actually, yeah, very bonding.
And you know, and I mean, I think we'll both know this, won't we? But it's one of the sort of secret sources of things that can work in meetings is activities that create that kind of experimentation together, instead of, you know, what feels like the default, which is we all sit in a room and listen to somebody present something, which doesn't create that. I don't really want to call it shared peril. I have to come up with a slightly nicer term for it, but doesn't create that shared spontaneity.
Yeah. And allows us, one, to just sit there and observe and witness, which also has this component of unhurriedness, of slowing down to listen to someone, even if you don't listen to their words, but maybe the activity, the dancing, performance. Yeah. I would like to close the conversation. So beautiful. There was one question that I ask all my guests, and I'm curious to hear your answer. What's your number one facilitation challenge?
Getting enough work, I think, is the honest answer. I'd like more. And when I say that, it's like it's getting the right kind of work. So it's getting the work that matches my own, you know, style and interests and preferences. Because, you know, it would probably be relatively easy to get certain standardized gigs, but those are probably not the ones I want. So getting enough work, or you know, and you know, maybe that's not putting it quite right. Another way of putting it, which might be slightly more wholehearted, would be, and I think I'm getting better at this, I remember figuring out for myself quite a few years ago when I wanted more work, and I thought, I love doing the work, but landing the work I don't like doing. And I asked myself, so I wonder how getting the work could be like the work. And I think I'm half getting better at figuring. I don't actually have the answer to that, but I think I'm closer to it in my practice. And there's something about one way I put it to myself sometimes is to say, you know, all of life is work. You know, if we stop thinking of work as the thing we do for money, but actually work is the expenditure of energy against resistance, then in order to stay alive, we do have to do quite a lot of that. We have to exercise, we have to move, we have to eat, we have to expend energy against resistance. And it's something about, you know, maybe I can deepen my practice of creativity and engagement in more of my life than just the stuff I'm paid to do, I suppose, or something like that.
Oh, this has the potential to become an entire separate episode.
Well, maybe we'll have an entire separate episode another time.
Yes, because I think that many in the audience can relate to that. And as facilitators, we love the work we do. We are so passionate about it. But the process of selling or promoting our work feels so wrong, because it is the exact opposite of what we're actually doing. What we're good at is to create real human connection, to slow down, to ask questions, to be authentic, to come to the core. And all this attracting clients, being attractive, is the opposite of that. So there must be another way for facilitators to actually attract the right work by doing what we enjoy doing. So I like that.
Yeah, well, and I think I noticed that I probably am getting better at it. I think I've unlearned all of that I learned when I was in marketing. I've had to gradually realize how little of that actually serves me, and that what works is, you know, being spontaneous, putting stuff out there that's quite informal, and, you know, and paying attention to the conversations I'm in, and so yes, in a way to kind of deepen the practice.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
It's really nice to be able to just unpack experience like that for a good chunk of time.
Yeah, we went to many different places. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And we'll put all your information in the show notes. If someone wants to connect and learn more
Fantastic.
about your work and work with you.
Fabulous. Brilliant. Thank you, Miriam. It's been
Thank you.
it's an absolute pleasure. Rob spoke very highly of you, and he was right.
Thank you.
Thank
Great
you very
pleasure.
much.